This week, the UK government took an unprecedented decision to block new legislation from the devolved Scottish Parliament, which would have simplified the process by which transgender men and women change their legally recognised gender. Under UK law, transgender people must have lived for 2 years as their acquired sex and must have an official medical diagnosis for gender dysphoria. The Scottish Parliament had voted to remove the need for medical diagnosis and instead rely on the principle of transgender people self-identifying as a particular sex. The reforms would also have cut the 2-year wait to 3 months, with 16 and 17-year-olds allowed to change their legally registered gender after 6 months. Aside from the constitutional dispute, the proposals themselves have been the subject of quite a lot of controversy. We've been speaking to people on both sides of the argument. First, let's hear the thoughts of Scottish transgender campaigner Heather Herbert, who describes how she thinks the ability to self-identify would affect the lives of trans people in Scotland.
The current process to change your gender identity in legal terms involves collating 2 years' worth of documentation, every bank letter, every bill, every pay slip. If you've had any medical intervention, not that you need medical intervention, getting all that information from your general practitioner, to have a panel of people who've never met you, who have no contact with you, assess if you're the gender that you are. This is a very laborious process. It's a process that a lot of trans people don't partake in because we can change pretty much all of our documentation, our passports, our driving licenses, our medical records. All of that information can be changed very simply. All a gender recognition certificate does is allow us to change our birth certificate, which then allows marriage certificates or death certificates to be updated correctly.
What difference would this law have made to your life as a transgender person had you been younger when it had been brought through?
I think the change is part of a bigger change in society. One of the hidden benefits in this whole debate is that for the first time, we've heard trans voices. When I was growing up, transgender people didn't exist. Nowadays, thanks partly to an increase in visibility, we exist and people can see us.
Now, even those who are very sympathetic to trans rights, I would suppose that although none of this has anything to do with medical intervention, I gather that, the main alarm bell that rings would be over age, 16. Are you old enough at 16 to decide what sex you are?
Most people have an idea of their gender identity from when they're very young, from when they're 3 or 4 years old. So 16 is quite a long time to have had that.
But on the issue of being sure of your gender identity from a very young age, I take your point that some people from birth feel that they identify as a different gender. Other people's feelings are more fluid, aren't they? There are cases of people who identify as female at 16 and at 26 want to be male again.
Yes, there are. There's two issues here, I feel. There are people who are uncertain, and those people under the proposed system can change back, and there's no penalty, and it's not a criminal matter for people to revert back to their original gender. There's another group of people who are broadly called detransitioners. They are people who consider themselves trans and then revert the process. Those people generally revert the process because of societal pressures rather than not being trans.
There are people whose opposition to these changes actually comes down to the fact that they don't believe that people can be gender fluid. What do you say to those people?
I sort of understand where they're coming from because I can't imagine not having changed my gender. You can't imagine what it's like not to live in the body in which you live in. However, in a civilized society, we accept that people have different experiences to us, and we believe those experiences.
That was the Scottish trans rights campaigner Heather Herbert. Now, according to the Scottish Government, their reforms would have increased the number of annual applications for gender recognition certificates from 30 to around 300. I put this figure to Susan Smith, director of For Women Scotland, an organisation which opposes the reforms on the grounds of women's safety. I asked her how problematic the new laws could be given the limited number of people involved.
Well, those numbers are considered to be quite conservative, actually, according to some of the organisations who have been pushing for this. But, this isn't really a numbers game. I don't know how many, as a percentage, priests in the Catholic Church were abusive. I don't know how many police officers are abusive. The fact is, we safeguard to try to stop these things happening. And if there are any systems or areas of society where people are considered to be above the law, they are going to take advantage of these things. And it's also, in terms of the numbers, you only need one male person, even if they have no ill intent towards women, to go into a women's only space, for that space to become a mixed sex space. And that then changes who can access it from the other side. Rape victims often say they are self-excluding from services because they include people who are male. That's not saying these people have ill intent. It's saying the impact on other people who are equally protected is disproportionate.
A number of women's groups, such as Rape Crisis, have come out in support of these reforms. Under the UK Equality Act of 2010, organisations that provide sex-specific services can already discriminate against trans individuals, regardless of whether they possess one of these certificates. In fact, they're strictly prohibited from exclusion based on possession of these certificates. So effectively, none of that changes with this reform.
No, that's not true either, because you have to look at what a GRC does. And a lot of people will tell you that it's a simple admin change and it only changes their birth certificate and the marriage certificate. There was a ruling before Christmas in a judicial review that we brought that said that those in possession of a GRC have changed their legal sex for all purposes under the Equality Act. That changes their legal status for quite a lot of organisations that fall beyond the scope of the rather narrow exceptions.
But fundamentally, this is boiling down to the fact that you believe that your gender is what you're born with, right? That somebody who was born male can become female.
No, I think there are people with gender dysphoria, and I think gender dysphoria must be a horrible, debilitating condition. I have every sympathy for people who are deeply unhappy about their bodies and their sex. And I think what those people need actually is proper medical help and care and therapy.
Some of the young people that you're talking about, some of them say that by transitioning, by becoming a different sex, they've made their lives much better, much happier. It does happen.
Yes, but the long-term studies show that most young people, if left alone, once they get through puberty, they accept themselves and then they tend to go on to have a much better life. The treatments that are being offered, so things like puberty blockers, the evidence that we're now seeing from countries that are further ahead of the curve on us on this.
Yeah, this has got nothing to do with puberty blockers. That's not in question in these laws at all.
Except they are in a way, because by dropping the age limit to 16, what we know from the Cass review is that affirming people has a tendency to push them onto a medical pathway. That the more you affirm people, the more likely they are to seek out medical interventions.
Susan Smith, co-director of a group called For Women Scotland. Latika, this is a cultural argument. It's a constitutional argument. We haven't really touched on that. But you think the debate at least is going quite well, quite healthily in the UK, don't you?
Look, I think it's better than the United States, but most political debates, particularly ones pertaining to issues like this, are conducted better outside of the United States. Having said that, I think it is important to state that there's two really important issues and very different issues at stake here. One, of course, is the contents of the bill in Scotland. The other is a constitutional war that's about to erupt or is erupting between the UK, Westminster, and Scotland, because the central government in Westminster is now using a block, which it hasn't used in the Scottish Parliament's history, to veto a law that's been passed in Scotland. By all parties, we might say. All parties in Scotland did vote for this bill, however unpopular it might be. And polls do actually show that this is not supported by the vast majority of the community. In fact, a poll that was taken just before this bill was passed showed that 66% of Scottish people opposed lowering the age threshold, including 63% from SNP voters. I mean, this is not a case settled politically within Scotland.
The dividing lines aren't clear on all sorts of levels, are they?
Exactly, just as much as this will then become a separate debate about the role of the UK vetoing Scottish bills.
Is Scotland ahead of the game here, Paul? This is a new fighting front for equal rights, isn't it?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, they're following the best advice of a lot of the human rights organisations and the United Nations, for example. Spain passed a very similar law at the end of last year as well. And that's my perspective. I think the UK administration...
Ireland and Norway also
absolutely should have said, this is fantastic, you're leading the way, and we'll work towards bringing a line in the UK, the rest of the UK, with this very sensible move from the Scottish Parliament.
That's your view. As Latika pointed out, it's not necessarily a majority view, even among supporters of the Scottish National Party that pushed it through Parliament.
Well, these things take time to shift through, and it takes a long time to shift public opinion towards it. But essentially, at the end of the day, making this as painless as possible for people who are going through extremely traumatic and difficult periods in their lives, reducing a lot of these restrictions so people can get on with their lives in a really productive way, particularly when they're quite young like this. They're very vulnerable at that age. I think the risks of are very over exaggerated in terms of people abusing this law.
Do you think there is a global direction of travel on this, Latika, finally?
No, I don't think there's a fait accompli on this at all. I think one thing's very, very strong, and it's common to all our societies, is the vast majority of people, including actually most MPs I speak to about this, do not want this debate conducted in a way that we have seen some sections on both sides go for it. Most people accept that gender dysphoria is a condition and that people who are suffering this should be treated with the utmost compassion and given every help that they can. That's very different, of course, to, I think, a majority, particularly of women who are a lot older, first-wave feminists, second-wave feminists, who believe that this is coming at some of their own rights. Now, I don't think those two things have to exist at all. I think it's possible to have a situation where you can treat people with gender dysphoria in a way that is compassionate and give them what they need without that encroaching onto women's rights. But I think in terms of is this settled, not at all.
Thank you. You're listening to Weekend here on the BBC.